Welcome, everybody, to today's community conversation. My name is Martín Uriarte, the Communications and Community Engagement Coordinator for the Alliance. That is a lot of words to just say I'm the person that says hi and puts a smile to the Alliance face and somebody that you can reach out to if you ever need help. We have a great event today. Dr. Lewis E. Newman is here with us today to talk about the all-important topic of teaching students critical thinking. So before we get started with that community conversation, just a couple of Alliance related things for those who maybe don't know about it or maybe are new to the field. I just always want to make sure that people know about it. So the first thing is being RCHEP, the Resource Community for Higher Education in Prison. It's a place to exchange resources and ideas, kind of like a Reddit for the HEP field, if you know what Reddit is. And if you don't, that's fine. Think of like a forum board, right? A place where people could put sticky notes of info on there. So huge, huge, huge resource. Definitely take a look at it if you're anybody that's trying to learn more about what's going on in the field. And then I also want to plug NCHEP, the National Conference on Higher Education in Prison. The 14th annual conference will be happening in April 10th to the 11th of next year, with the theme of a new era, Pell reinstatement, and the future of prison education. So this will be taking place in New Orleans. We being the Alliance just visited New Orleans for a little strategic planning and checking out the hotel and everything like that. And it was my first time at New Orleans, and it was actually really, really fun. It's also going to be my first time at NCHEP. So by default, this will be the best NCHEP ever. I really hope you guys will be there. Registration will open up around mid-January, I believe, is what we're aiming for. Next month for sure. So please keep an eye out on our socials, because it's going to sell out fast. If you've been to NCHEP, you know it sells out fast. So definitely register when you can, as soon as you can. And so with that business stuff out of the way, let's keep the show going. So today's community conversation is exactly just that. It's a community conversation. We want to keep it a little informal. So we'll talk a little bit for a bit, but then just kind of get things going. But then afterwards, we would like if people, pop in questions either by Q&A or just raise your hand. This is like a Zoom meeting. I can see people's faces down here. When I'm looking here, I'm seeing faces. So raise your hand. Let us know if you want to chime in with anything. It could be a question. It could be just a personal insight that you have on it. It could be a correction, because I'm not perfect either. So let me know. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lewis. If you can give us a brief introduction, that'd be great.
Thank you, Martine. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this community conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us today from wherever you're coming in from. So just a bit of background about me. I'm a lifelong faculty member. I taught for most of my career at Carleton College in Minnesota, small liberal arts college. I did my PhD work at Brown University before I got that position in 1983. Carleton was a great place. I loved teaching there. I was actually a Minnesotan by birth and by upbringing, and so it was a chance to go home in a lot of ways. And I stayed there for 33 years, moved into the administration during the last part of my time there, first as the director of the Learning and Teaching Center, which is kind of the in-house think tank on all learning and teaching questions at the college. And subsequently then into the dean's office, where I was overseeing the academic advising program, the community engagement program, and a few other miscellaneous things. At a certain point, my 3-year stint in the dean's office was coming to an end, and I was looking for other administrative opportunities. And long story short, I was fortunate to get a position as the dean of academic advising at Stanford. So left Minnesota, moved to the Palo Alto area, where my wife had also been in years earlier in her life, and so it was a lovely homecoming for her and an opportunity for a great position for me. At Stanford, I oversaw an office that managed undergraduate advising for the undergraduates of the university. We also ran the new student orientation programs, a summer bridge program for first-gen low-income students, and our office managed all exceptions to academic policy, had to be approved by our office, as well as we did all of the academic progress review. That is to say, any students on academic probation had to be reviewed by folks in our office. So we used to say that it was the office that really had the most direct and ongoing contact with the undergraduates at Stanford. And I loved it. It was a great position. I did that for 6 years and retired 2 years ago in 2022. And about that time, somewhat after, a book that I had been working on really for quite a number of years before that came out, a book called Thinking Critically in College, The Essential Handbook for Student Success. And that's the one that, thank you, Martin, that I will really be talking about. It's that book that got me involved in teaching some at Mount Tamalpais College at San Quentin, and which I'm happy to talk more about, and got me interested in prison education generally, but also just in how we teach critical thinking skills to college students broadly. And I'm happy to share what I've learned about that and have a conversation with all of you. Maybe that's plenty of background.
Well, we got about another 50 minutes. So if you want to keep doing more background, that'd be great. But if not, we can definitely just roll into it. Like Lewis mentioned, we'll be kind of referencing to this book a lot. I had the honor to actually read it. It is a fantastic, fantastic book. Yeah, you'll hear me gush about it multiple times throughout this conversation. So apologies there. I swear he did not pay me at all to say any of this stuff. It's all from the heart here. So you mentioned Mount Tamalpais, mentioned getting into writing this book. So I guess we could start off with the question of what inspired you to actually write this book to begin with? And then we'll roll into like, how did, from writing this book and your background, Carleton and Minnesota and all of this, did you end up teaching a course in Mount Tamalpais?
Sure thing. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for your appreciative words about the book. I wrote the book. I tell this story actually in the introduction. I can try to tell it somewhat briefly here anyway. Late in my career, actually, before I became a full-time administrator, one of the classes I was teaching was a seminar. And as I did in all my seminars, I had students do brief research projects. Carleton is on a trimester system, so these are 10-week courses. There's a kind of a limited scope of research you can do in that time. But I had research as part of the course, and toward the end of the course, every student had to give an oral presentation on the research they'd been doing and get feedback from the other students in the seminar. My practice was always to videotape those presentations so that I could then sit with the student, give them feedback both on the content and on the presentation style itself, the effectiveness of the presentation. So with that background, I'm sitting talking to a student named Rachel, who's given me permission to use her name. Rachel was a great student. She was a senior. She was a religion major. I think probably the faculty in the department would have named her as the best student in that year's graduating class by good margin. And we're sitting and we're talking about the presentation. I said to Rachel, this was a terrific presentation. You did great research. You organized it really effectively. Your oral presentation was incredibly smooth and fluid. It was great. It would have been just that much better if you had begun by telling us what questions you were trying to answer before you actually told us all that great information. And she kind of, looked up and, kind of leaned in. And so I said, well, it's a little bit like anytime you read something, you should be asking yourself, like, what are the questions that this author was trying to answer? And why did that person go about answering them this way? So she now, perked up a little more and leaned in a little more. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm on a roll. I'm going to keep going. So I said, okay, well, like anytime you look at a syllabus for a course, you could be asking yourself, like, what are the questions that this course is designed to explore? And why might the professor have organized the course in the way that they did in order to explore those questions? And by this point, she was sort of flabbergasted and looked back at me in a way I will never forget. It's one of those teaching moments that kind of hits you like a ton of bricks. She looked at me in this voice that was partly frustration and partly sadness. And she said, why has nobody ever told me this before? And I thought to myself in that moment, how did she get to be a senior and nobody has ever told her before that, like, it's no, like, college education is not just about the information anymore. It's about the questions you ask about that information. It's about the questions that generated that information. It's about the ways in which we can interrogate the assumptions that are in everything we encounter. That's what we're doing here. And that was news to her. I was shocked in a way that it was news to her, given what a good student she was, and that she was in her senior year at this point. But then I began to think, I've never said this to any student that way before. Like, I've been teaching now for 30 years. How is it possible that I have never actually said to a student, like, this is what it looks like to think like a college student. This is what we expect you to do. And it's no longer just absorbing information that somebody provides and regurgitating it accurately, which, frankly, is, I think, for the most part, a lot of what high school education is, unless you're fortunate enough to go to a really rigorous, academically, uh, demanding high school. So all that to say, that was kind of what got me thinking about this topic. I never imagined I would write a book about critical thinking in college. That's not my field per se. I'm a religious studies scholar, as I said. But then I began to think, well, how could we be helping students, especially beginning college students, get the hang of how do you think like a college student as opposed to thinking like a high school student? And what does that entail? What are the other things that students don't know that we haven't told them that we probably should have told them? And that's what got me on this path. And after a lot of research and looking into what other books, experts about critical thinking had to say, that took me down a rabbit hole for a while. And talking to colleagues and talking to students and looking at a lot of college assignments from across the curriculum to actually see, well, what is it that we actually ask students to do on our assignments? And do we identify clearly what it is that we're asking them to do? So with all of that, I began to put together this book. And of course, it went through a number of iterations and revisions before it got published. But that's the story of how the book came about. And since then, I have been doing presentations, sometimes like this, sometimes to faculty, sometimes to students in a variety of places, and sometimes to college access organizations that are working with first-gen students to just sort of help them think about how could we be teaching these skills more directly, more effectively in ways that we haven't been. Because I think by and large, at least in my experience, most college faculty imagine that students either know how to do this or they just pick it up by osmosis, basically. Like, just in the course of being educated and taking our classes, they learn how to think critically. But that's not necessarily the case. And they certainly aren't self-aware of what it is that they're doing when they're doing that. So that's the book. The story of my connection to Mount Tamalpais, I'll say just a little bit more briefly. I got connected with Jody Lewin, who's the president of the college, through a mutual friend, as I recall, and I was very interested in the work that she was doing. She became interested in this book, thought that it would be a real resource and value for the students in their program at San Quentin, and so we began to think about whether there was a way for me to offer something. I live on the peninsula, so if you know the Bay Area geography, you know that I'm, probably a good hour and some, at least on a good day, from San Quentin, before you allow for all of the security going into the prison and back out again and so forth. So all that to say, it wasn't reasonable for me to give an extended course that involved going a lot of times, but I did do a 6-session course, kind of an enrichment course over the summer in June of 2023, which is a very powerful experience. I'm happy to talk more about that as well. But basically, we covered six of the 8 chapters in the book during those 6 sessions, and that was an opportunity to engage with those students and see how this material resonated with them. And that was a really valuable experience for me.
Okay. I'm connecting the dots here. Yeah, I read about Rachel because like you said, it's in the beginning of the book. Yeah, man, that was a very, I almost want to say, therapeutic moment for me. I was a kid who grew up in the hoods of LA. and raised by a single parent mother and was pretty much a latchkey kid. So I didn't really have either a parental figure really at home teaching me like, well, this is how you do your homework or this is how you do things. And then at Los Angeles Unified School District, especially at that in the 90s, was very much just like, we just need butts and seats and that's all we care about. And so I went kind of through this motion for most of my K through 12 years, to be honest. And I had this mindset of just like, man, I'm not smart. And then later on, it was like, okay, I'm smart, but I'm just different smarts, right? I'm not book smart. I'm not academic minded. I could never be PhD or whatever it is. Um, and that's, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of people that would have that same thought, especially coming from at-risk backgrounds or maybe not even at-risk backgrounds, but just the wrong people around their lives, right? And so reading, I remember I like highlighted it somewhere where I was just like, yeah, that hit hard. Where Rachel was talking about, yeah, just like, why hasn't anyone ever told me this before? Spoken with a mixture of sadness and frustration. Like, literally, why hasn't anyone told me this before? And I feel as though kind of to what you were saying, where high school is a lot of just regurgitation. Um, a lot of regurgitation. I remember studying a lot to try to remember the facts, but not actually absorbing the information. It was just so I can get that passing grade and then move on. And it was like, well, okay, whatever, that was useless. Um, and so, yeah, it's a lot of that frustration of why hasn't anyone told me this before? Because I feel as though there's a lot of, especially in college, assumed knowledge that you have coming into this. You should know how to do this. I think even had teachers tell me this of like, why are you writing this way? You should know how to do this. You should know how to do that. Um, but everybody's different, just like how we have a lot of people in different parts, different roles that are in attendance today. There's different students of all types. And some of them, like you said, preparatory schools, right? They know how to do everything. They're the A students that are flying high. And then there might be somebody who's first generation scholar who is also working nighttime jobs and a part-time job in the day and this and that, and they don't have time to really figure it out. Um, I feel like connected to Mount Tamalpais, I feel like that's a harder environment to kind of get taught, right? The right way to actually do the education, regardless if it's a quality program or otherwise. So you mentioned you did 6 sessions. Um, Given the fact that students have all different walks of life, and given the fact that you don't really know what you're going to get in, incarcerated program, um, what are some strategies you think people here in this community conversation can actually like take out of the book and you know take it back to wherever their programs are, whoever they know, and say, hey, I spent an hour listening to these two guys chat for a bit. This is the biggest takeaway that I got from it. We should probably buy some of these books and like send them in there and do whatever we can. What do you think is that?
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. There are a couple of different ways I might answer this.
Mm.
Um, One is, I will say that it is true, of course, that the students who were in this succession little mini class that I did had a whole range of different backgrounds. Some of them had clearly had college um, backgrounds to some extent before they were incarcerated. Other people, I think, had started, in the remedial program to get their GED before they even continued with the college program, which is a 2-year program at Mount Tamalpais College. Um, so really, again, a very mixed background. The book, I will say, is designed in a way as a textbook. So that is to say, it has summaries at various points, key points that are highlighted and put in a little box. It has questions for reflection at the end of each chapter. It has interactive exercises. You can thank the anonymous readers at one of the presses that ultimately chose not to publish the book, but gave me the benefit of the feedback from their readers for all of those different features, because that actually, I think, made it a more useful book and more interactive book. And I think that in that way, the book almost teaches itself, in the sense that if you guide someone through it and actually have them do the exercises and write something in response to one or more of those reflection questions about each chapter, they will be engaging with the material in a deeper way. And so in that sense, I think there are some techniques that are sort of built into the book. That's one way of coming at that. The other thing I would say, and this is, look, there are a lot of books out in the world about critical thinking, and I read a number of them in the process of working on this one, and I learned that there's a whole range of ways of thinking about what critical thinking is, and there's a whole literature about this. And what I discovered was that people who are engaged in studying critical thinking are often talking past one another, because some of them are philosophers, and some of them are neuroscientists, and some of them are educational psychologists, and some of them are, there are all sorts of people who use that term and throw it around. So much so that the term has almost become a buzzword, and kind of, some people suggested I not even use it in the book, because it had lost its meaning.
Mhm.
So the way I tackled that, and this is maybe to get to your question, Martin, I began to do this sort of inductively. As I said, I looked at assignments that faculty actually gave students at Carleton from across the curriculum. And I had a very helpful, smart group of undergraduate research assistants at Stanford who went through those assignments with me. And we began to tag them and code them for what kind of critical thinking was being required of them. And at the end of the day, we came down with just four. There are really just four kinds of critical thinking in the context of college education that really matter. And those four are covered in the chapter that I call Critical Thinking 101. And here they are, and you can put them on a note card. It's exploring context, comparing alternatives, weighing evidence, and considering implications and new applications of something they've learned. So I'll do those again: context, comparison, evidence, and implications/applications. Every single assignment asks students to do one or more of those four things. And I will tell you that I've done presentations now with faculty in places all over the country, and invited them in the course of my presentation to say, hey, if I'm missing something here, let me know. I want to know if I need to revise the book in the next edition. Tell me if you're in your discipline, maybe something else is missing. Needless to say, context can mean a number of different things. Comparison can be a number of different kinds of things. But each one of them, when I do this presentation for faculty, I give sample questions that, if you were looking at context, what are the kinds of things you would be asking? If you're looking at evidence, what are the kinds of questions we ask about evidence, and so forth. And needless to say, it's different if you're teaching chemistry than it is if you're teaching history or psychology or some other subject, right? But nonetheless, if you could get students to think context, comparison, evidence, and implications, that's what you're being asked to do over and over again. It's not, it's simple. That doesn't make it easy, but it
Mhm.
is simple. There are no other kinds of questions that I think we regularly ask students in college to think about. And if we can get students to focus on those and recognize the different ways in which those things show up on assignments, one of the chapters in the book is specifically about parsing assignments from different fields with an eye toward which of those four is being asked of you here, and how is that embedded in this assignment, and how would you tackle it? That I think they would be way ahead. They would have the sort of tools that we want them to have and regularly practice using in order to do the work that we ask them to do. But instead of that, we just give them the work and ask them to do it, and don't tell them exactly what it is that we're asking them mentally, cognitively to do. And then they fumble around until they kind of figure it out, hopefully, right, over time. And that's if there's a sort of a something new and innovative in the book that you won't find elsewhere, it's that, I think, typology of what critical thinking boils down to. So, in that sense, I think, Martin, one of the things that all of you on the call might take away is that's the core of it. The rest of the book is how to do that in terms of writing, how to do that in terms of research, how to do that in terms of tackling ordinary assignments and so forth. But the core of it is simply those four basic categories of questions that we ask students to work on. And if we could find ways of embedding that in our curriculum, with or without my book, that I think would be a major a major step forward.
Mhm. Yeah, having read the book, I would agree with that. You mentioned the different disciplines, and I was trying to think back through it, and you do have, like, again, the Essential Handbook for Student Success is a great like subtitle on it because it just very much so covers everything you probably would come across. And even chapters that, like, trust me, I've read a fair number of self-help books, uh, but doing research, from consuming knowledge to creating it, things of that nature. But it's also areas that I think people need to hear at times. Like, it's okay to ask for help. I feel as though that's a very basic thing of, like, yeah, it's okay to ask for help. But we're all afraid to ask for help, right? Like, the services are there, the help is there, but sometimes we don't even do it. Very much so. You had mentioned a part of, like, office hours are there, but you don't want to necessarily go in because you don't want to look dumb asking for the questions or anything of that sort. So it's a very comprehensive book that covers a lot of things, from just the basic of how to navigate through the school system to actually applying those four steps that you mentioned. And I do see that common theme as I'm reflecting back through the chapters. Um, One of the questions that I had pre-written out was, like, what do you see as the biggest misconception about critical thinking among students? Because I feel like, to the point that I had mentioned earlier about how I didn't think I was academic minded at one point in my life. Sometimes you have to rewire the lens, right, of, like, how people are observing things. And some people, even though they have the ability to think a certain way, may think about it like, oh, critical thinking. No, that's not even what I. Some people might not even know what critical thinking really truly is, right? They have some completely different definition attached to it. Um, so what are some big misconceptions you found through both your actual, teaching career, but in writing this book? And then, did you see any of those manifest in either different ways or similar ways when you were teaching your Mount Tamalpais course?
Yeah. Uh, well, first, let me just comment on the other piece that you mentioned, Martin, which is the book is really about critical thinking,
Mhm.
and I think it actually fills a niche in that sense because other college success books, at least the ones that I've looked at, and I looked at quite a number, really do say a lot of very basic stuff. And again, of course, it's mostly focused on students in traditional settings, needless to say, but it's you know, learn how to get along with your roommate, or learn how to manage your time well, or go to your professor's office hours and
Set up alarms.
so forth. Right. All of which is good, fine advice, right? And some of that is applicable to incarcerated students. I'm sure some of it is not. But the thing that we don't do is really explain to students like Rachel, like none of those books would tell Rachel that it was helpful to her, like, to ask the question before she starts answering it if she's giving a presentation. Right. Um, so that's what I really tried to focus on. That said, it became clear to me at a certain point through the feedback that I was getting from focus groups and faculty colleagues that I shared pieces of this with, that it would be really good to have some of that in there too. So I use the metaphor of a journey kind of as a thread throughout the book. And then in between the main chapters, I have these little 2 to 3 page pieces that I call advice for the road ahead. And that includes things like learning how to ask for help and developing a growth mindset and what I call joining a team, working together in groups and taking risks and a variety of things. So that's a dimension of the book which is not really about critical thinking. It's just about kind of how to make the most of your college education and do it in a way that will benefit you. So with that, I would just shift then again to your question, Martine. I think for the most part, I'll be honest, I think the vast majority of students that I've encountered, whether that's students at Carleton that I taught during all those years, or students at Stanford that I worked with, not as a faculty member, but in other capacities, most students are mostly not thinking about critical thinking, right? They haven't like they're there to get an education, maybe to get a job on the other end, maybe because somebody expects them to be there and they haven't even really thought about what it is that they're supposed to be doing. One of the points that I make in the book over and over in various ways is, yes, of course you can look at your education as a path to a job, but you really want to be using your education to train your mind to be sharper, to be a better learner, to think about how you think and think about how other people think and learn how to do that effectively. And when you come away with that, out of your college education, you're really prepared to do any job. You're prepared for all sorts of things in life besides jobs, like what medical decisions am I going to make on behalf of myself or my family? Well, I'd want to think about context. I'd want to think about evidence. I'd want to compare possibilities and weigh the pros and cons. Right? All of those skills that we ask students to apply in their academic work are also skills that we use in our lives when we're making all sorts of decisions.
Mhm.
So I try to make the point that those are really the most enduring benefits of a college education. And I think that applies to incarcerated students every bit as much as students on the outside. So the first thing I would say is that I think by and large students aren't thinking about these things. And one of the ways that we can, I think, uh, benefit them, help them, is to really get them to focus on this stuff. Because I think that if we're not focused on this, whatever information we're giving them, frankly, is likely to be outdated after a certain period of time anyway. And mostly they're not likely to remember it, truthfully. Most
Mhm.
studies have shown that a certain number of years after college, most students have forgotten most of what they studied, unless they're very actively using it in their jobs. But
Mhm.
so really what I'm making a pitch for here is a kind of way of delivering a college education which focuses on these skills that are essential to their academic success, but also essential to the kinds of things that they're going to need to do in life um,
Mhm.
throughout their lives in all sorts of contexts. Um, so I'm not sure that precisely answered your question, Martine, but I guess I would say that I think if anything, most students come in with this is a misconception or about their education as much as anything. It's that their education is mostly about gathering information. It's mostly about checking off boxes and finishing requirements and getting to the finish line, right? And,
Mhm.
you know, you do need to check boxes and you do need to get to the finish line. But if that's all you're focused on, you're missing out. You're like sleepwalking,
Mhm.
your education. Um,
Mhm.
and what I heard you saying, Martine, earlier was that in a certain sense, at least maybe through elementary and secondary school, that's kind of where you were. And that's where I think a lot of students are, frankly, and including students who've come from really, much more privileged backgrounds and schools that would ostensibly have been preparing them for college. And even then,
Mhm.
I was working at Stanford where, less than 4% of students get admitted. So you're talking actually, about a very high functioning, very highly motivated body of students. That said, even those students aren't necessarily focused on this as the goal of their education. And I think that's what we can be giving them is a clearer sense of what they can really be getting out of their education that will serve them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely view this as I've been using the word universally applicable a lot when it comes to this book, because I do believe it is applicable to all aspects of life. Um, I feel like the question that is jumping around in my head right now is it's twofold. Well, one, I have a two beautiful daughters, a 4-year-old and a 10-month-old. And I'm just like, okay,
Congratulations.
thank you. And I'm just like, how do we start this early with my girls, right? To start thinking critically. So that's on the personal end. But then it's also from like the HEP end is hearing stories. Even our executive director at one point was just like, nah, I don't want to worry about that when he was incarcerated about education. Like he was just like, oh, why do I do this? And it took a special element for him to necessarily get involved with it. And I'm sure there are lots of other people currently incarcerated that are also like, why do I care? Right. And some of the things he had mentioned, it's also about if you were to get released, right? It's going to be great for your career and this and that and that. Not everybody that takes a program in an incarcerated space will have a release date. So I'm guess what I'm trying to get at is how do we get those that may not understand, like my 4-year-old and my definitely my 10-month-old who would just be angry at me, or the people that are currently incarcerated that maybe have access to a program, but they aren't sold on it because of either background or they just don't see the value. How do we how can we set up these potential and future students for success with critical thinking and just maybe plant that seed in there?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I have
You may not
grandchildren
have the
who
answer. It's okay if
who
you
are
don't.
who are the age of your children, Martin. So and I talk with them a lot. Um, so what I would say is, and I make this point throughout the book, critical thinking is all about asking questions, right? It's not about information, as I said, it's about the questions we ask about it. I often say to students when I do talks to students, as I just did a couple of these in various places um, when I was traveling in the Philadelphia area a couple of weeks ago. And the reality is, I say to students, if all that mattered was the amount of information you had at your fingertips, all of you would be the smartest human beings who ever lived because you have more information at your fingertips than any prior generation of in the history of humanity. That doesn't actually make you the smartest people who've ever lived because it's not about having more information. It's about knowing what to do with it. And it's about knowing what questions to ask about it. So one of the things that I would do with children, and I think you can begin to do this, not I don't about a 10-month-old, but certainly with children who are verbal, a 4-year-old and beyond, right? You can be saying to them when they notice something, you could be saying, oh, um, here's a question I have about that. I wonder about this, and you can begin to implant in them the habit of regularly asking questions. Now, children regularly ask questions all the time. I know my grandchildren are asking why constantly about just about everything, right? But you can continue to promote and encourage that question asking and encourage them to ask questions that they maybe haven't even thought of yet. Right, and so on. And I think the more we do that, the more we prime them to realize that this is a natural human phenomenon. We all ask questions, but to do it rigorously and to do it consistently about a whole range of different kinds of things, right? Not just the things that are immediately grabbing their attention, but things that just kind of cross their path that you might ask, well, gee, why do you suppose that's happening? Right? Even if they haven't thought to ask that yet, right? So there's a lot of ways in which I think we can encourage that inquisitiveness. Uh, in terms of the second part of your question, Martin, what I would say is, at least in my very, again, limited experience working with these students at Mount Ham College, it felt to me as though the students who were there had already bought into the notion that there was something valuable here. There was some way in which they would improve their lives, whether they ever got out of prison or not, because they understood that it's a way of being free, if you will, even if their bodies are not free, their minds can be free. Their minds can be free to investigate things. Their minds can be free to ask questions, to interrogate the information that they get, that they hear on the yard from others that they're incarcerated with. every time you question somebody tells you a story and you ask yourself, I wonder about the context of that relationship or that person, or what else happened that may, provide a different perspective on that, or maybe this person has one way of understanding this, but maybe there's another way. I should compare possible interpretations of what that person is reporting to me, or maybe there's some evidence that's missing from this person's account, or maybe, right, you filter information that's coming in more effectively and critically if you have that set of critical questions in mind all the time. So just in terms of your relationships with others, in terms of your own ability to expand your horizons and understand yourself and the world better, all of these are ways in which I think the people that I worked with at least understood that education was the key to doing that. And I was making the case that critical thinking was the key to their education. And they were quite receptive to that. And I would just add, I mean, I think again, whether you're incarcerated or not, right? We're inundated with information, and we have to find ways of determining which information is reliable, which information is worth acting on, which information isn't, what other questions we want to be asking about anything that someone tells us or anything that we read, anything that comes across our path, because otherwise we're just sort of prone to being misled, even duped by people who don't necessarily have our best interests in mind, and frankly, who have their own interests in mind, which might be to persuade us that something is true when it's really not entirely true. And I think everybody wants to go through life feeling like they can discern what's true and what's not. Um, so anyway, all that to say, I think that there are ways of making this way of thinking about education, I think makes it even more applicable to people's lives, whether they ever use it for purposes of a job outside of the prison context or not.
The ability to think for yourself.
Ability to think for yourself. Exactly. And think well. And
Yeah.
notice when you're not thinking well, like be self-critical, right? Ask those same questions about yourself, right?
Mm.
Who am I? What has shaped me? What contexts have shaped me and the way that I think and the way that I respond to things, right? You'll be more self-aware if you're
Mm.
asking these critical questions all the time. What evidence do I have that that's really true? Right? So on, right?
Yeah, I hear that. Thank you for that. So I'm looking through the chat right now. Because I did see a question earlier. So Trip Taylor asked, what are your thoughts on critical thinking capability in regards to brain development? In other words, not fully developed until 25 for most males, etc. And also in regards to post-trauma related to incarceration.
Wow. I confess I don't know enough or have enough experience probably to answer that question very, very fully. I don't know a lot about brain development. I do understand that humans' brains don't fully develop until about 20, early 20s, maybe mid 20s. Um, and I certainly am not a trauma specialist. What occurs to me though is just this, that even people, well, as I was saying earlier to your question, Martina, about your children, long before you reach that point in your late adolescence or early young adulthood, we can be training ourselves to ask these questions. We may get better and better at it as we get older and more mature, and less impulsive, because in a certain way, critical thinking is the opposite of impulsivity. It's the ability to stand back and suspend judgment for a while until we ask some questions and try to get a better handle on what's actually in front of us, right? So in a certain way, all of that I think can be beneficial. No doubt, people who are traumatized either before or even during the period of their incarceration, either way, um, have other obstacles to overcome, because that, I'm sure, impairs your ability to think objectively and critically and so forth. And I don't know specifically how to address that, except to say that if anything, I would imagine that it's even more important for people under those circumstances to have these tools at their disposal, even if it's also harder for them to utilize them, to draw on them um, consistently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are good points. And I always like hearing from people that actually aren't the experts. Because sometimes you get stuck in like your own little like tunnel of information, right? And it's always the same info that you're coming in with outside lenses actually really is useful. I know Corrine, you said you had received an anonymous question. Did you want to
Yeah,
go
and
ahead?
then we can turn to Ved after that. So this person has kind of a two-part question. As someone who has not yet read your book, how do you motivate and inspire students to see critical thinking as an essential part of their daily lives beyond education, especially incarcerated students? And two, can you also talk about your discussion about critical thinking with incarcerated students? For example, in the prison environment where language and thinking is the absolute authority, like there are kind of sort of spoken and unspoken restrictions on the way that people are asked to think or not think. So how does critical thinking play a role there? How do you talk about it in that environment?
Boy, both really good questions. So let me go back again. The first question was just about frame that for me again because I got drawn
Yeah,
into the second question.
sorry.
Uh,
Kind of like critical thinking in daily lives, especially
right.
for incarcerated
Yes.
students.
Yes. Thank you. Right. I mean, I think the simplest way to do this, and I've done it with students that I've talked to, and I don't think that incarcerated students in this regard are really any different, right? Provide a whole slew of different kinds of very real world daily examples of times and places where, you know, uh, everybody, including incarcerated people, are aware of the news. They're aware of what's happening, both within the prison and outside the walls of the prison. They're reading about political news. They're reading about all sorts of things that they're hearing about, right? You can be asking them, okay, so there's this story about so and so, and somebody did such and such, or there's a policy of one kind or another that's being considered by the state legislature or by somebody else or by the prison authorities themselves or whatever it might be. Like, how would you begin to sort of break that down and ask yourself questions about it? What sorts of questions would you want to ask? You know, just to make them aware of the fact that whether it's in the academic context where they're going to be, you know, graded on it or not, right? It's still useful to use these skills and this set of questions for just evaluating all of the information that they get and that they use all the time. Um, News is a perfectly good example because the news is full of all sorts of information about things that can be questioned and interrogated. But you know, I think that in my experience, again, teaching this material at Mount Tamalpais College, what I found was that the students were incredibly receptive. What I meant in part earlier when I said it was a very powerful experience was it could easily, in many ways, have been a Carleton College classroom. And Carleton College, if you're not familiar with it, is a very fine, highly selective liberal arts college, generally ranked in the top 10 in the country. Yeah, so you're getting students who are extremely well prepared. You're getting students who are very highly motivated, who are eager to learn, and so on. And and the students at Mount Tamalpais were no less eager to learn and no less receptive to thinking about their education as something that would liberate them, that would really give them an opportunity to think. I mean, as I said to them the very last day of class, um, truthfully, however much prison authorities may try to do it differently. The fact of the matter is that your minds are free. They cannot ultimately control your mind. They can control your movement. They can control, you know, a whole range of things about what you wear and what you do and what you're, you know, capable of accomplishing in a whole range of ways. But they can't chain your mind. Your mind is free. And the more you develop your mind to think critically, the freer you are, the more capable you are of thinking for yourself, of asking critical questions about everything and everyone. And that's a kind of freedom that everybody has. That's what liberal education literally means. It means a liberating education, a freeing education. And I said that to the students in the class the last day, how much I admired the fact that they were giving their time to doing this while they were incarcerated, and how much I admired them for their commitment to their education, and made that pitch that this was the best way for them, even if they never left this place, to liberate themselves in one way at least that mattered. And I dare say you could have heard a pin drop in that room at that moment. I think they felt very much like they were being empowered through this way of thinking, and through somebody who, as an educator, was telling them, this is what your college education can do for you.
I believe that. I believe the pin drop thing, because honestly, just hearing you say it right now, was just like chills, right? Yeah, it's powerful stuff for sure. And yeah, I don't know. I'm just amazed by educators in general. My mom was a long-term substitute teacher, so I kind of like saw her go around and do things. And I was just like, man, I don't really get it. But then I meet people like yourself and other people in the field who are doing this. And it's always coming from a place of just like passion. And it's just, I really, really admire that and appreciate that. Um, let's see here. I think, Ved, you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I think in part, thanks, Louis, for this presentation. Apologies for being off camera. I'm from the vehicle right now, about to do a finance meeting with some folks, but nonetheless, I didn't want to miss this. And so the question that you kind of just answered and that was posed is similar to mine. I'm just curious, how can what are the tools or tactics that you think are critical to building a classroom culture that welcomes each other to develop curiosity and like being challenged, considering the environment that they're in, right? Like in a prison setting that doesn't necessarily welcome people to interrogate things, and in some cases that sort of stuff is punished, right? And I know we have control of our mind, but I also think that people's minds are conditioned to comply and not challenge a lot of times in these spaces. And so how do you create a classroom environment in a space, or how would you tell others how to create a space where that can happen? And how do you overcome the environment of the prison that kind of pushes you not to think like that?
Boy.
And especially like with like understanding the role of power and how it can be, oppressive in these spaces. So
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say is that I, again, have very limited experience, directly in the prison context. So I want to say whatever I say here tentatively. I think that this problem is on a spectrum, in the sense that there are a lot of people in our society generally who don't want to encourage us to think too critically, who want us to sort of be swept away by whatever it is that they're inundating, whatever information they're inundating us with, to try to persuade us to buy something, to do something, to avoid something, to fear something, to whatever. So I think that in a certain way, we're all conditioned, frankly, to not do a lot of critical thinking, right? Now, that's at one end of the spectrum. Obviously, in the context of a prison, there is a much, much stronger presence of authoritative forces and powers that are constraining people's choices and constraining people's minds. And I can only imagine that if you spend enough years in that setting, you internalize a lot of that sense of constraint, and I'm not going to challenge, I'm not going to question. what I would say to any educator who is stepping into that environment is to name that issue directly and openly for at the get-go. Really to say the purpose of education is to get you to ask questions. If you're not interested in asking questions or you don't feel free to ask questions, right? This is maybe not something you're ready for. If you're ready to ask questions, if you're ready to be challenged by other people's questions, then you're ready to engage in the great adventure that we call education. And that's what it is. It's an adventure. It's an opportunity to explore, learn, grow, change, impact the world, all of those things through the power of our minds. And that's what makes education so important. That's what I felt called to as an educator all those years ago is this is an opportunity, whether it's in prison or out of prison, to shape young people's minds and help them grow and help them develop and do exactly what it sounds like, Martín, maybe your early teachers didn't so much do as you know, they wanted you to be sitting there in the seat so they could count you as present, but they weren't necessarily right as focused as they might have been on helping you think about what the purpose of your education was or could be. And what I would say is, if I were an educator doing this more regularly, as I gather many or all of you are doing, I would begin there. I would begin by saying, what is education for? What are we here for? What is this about? And what it's really about is helping us learn how to think better, ask more questions, be aware of the kinds of questions that that are bubbling up inside of us that we are afraid to ask. What are we afraid of? What might happen to us if we ask those questions? To say a classroom is a safe space in which we can ask those questions. And even if not every question, I mean, I can imagine in certain contexts that there are kinds of questions in a classroom. If you're studying the history of prisons in America, there might be certain questions that are not allowed, certain materials or things that are not allowed on the syllabus. I don't know how that works, but all I can say is I can imagine there could be constraints. But even then, there are a lot of ways in which it seems to me that this can be a safe space in which students can very slowly begin to break out of some of those constraints and fears and begin to ask questions and train their minds to ask even more questions and to recognize that when they're being challenged by questions coming from the faculty member or from other students in the class, that's all part of the give and take and all part of the process of learning and growing. And those are not personal attacks. They're attacks on or challenges to the ideas that you have or to the way that you responded to something. So I think we can help students, especially incarcerated students, learn how to ask questions and to not be afraid of asking questions. In fact, to see it as a wonderful opportunity that a college education can offer them, maybe especially in prison when it's countercultural.
Thank you for that. So yeah, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Louis, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insights. Your book, Thinking Critically in College, the Essential Handbook for Student Success is, yeah, it's a game changer. It's an amazing book. There's a section at the very beginning where you talk about your grandkids, and yeah, it just like, I have no way of knowing whether I will have the privilege of watching them someday begin their college journeys. But it is my hope that when they do, they will pick up this book and know that their papa tried to ease their path just a little. Like, that's a place of love, right? This is actually something that, like, it's a weird, beautiful blend of love, passion, and knowledge. So definitely, if you have any students that you care about or you're working with, please try to get them this book. It is amazing. I vouch for it for sure. And lastly, before we go, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you. And look it over down this way because that's the only way I can see your face right now. But like, just thank you for making this an incredible year. This is the last event of 2024. And as we continue on into the holiday seasons, I hope you find time to relax. We're all doing a lot of hard work. Please take care of yourselves. This is a kind of trauma-filled field at times. So yeah, take time to relax, reflect, enjoy the people you care about. And, 2025 is around the corner, full of new opportunities, new challenges, new Advance, and Chip, and Chip. No, but seriously, thank you, everyone. So from the Alliance, thank you. We wish you a very happy holiday and a wonderful new year. Stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you next year.
Thank you, Martín. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.